Hey guys, so we're back reading Black Marxism. We are on the last section of C.L.R. James in the Black Radical Tradition. This is part 3 of the book, Black Radicalism and Marxist Theory. And the section that we're going to read is Coming to Terms with the Marxist Tradition, and this is going to be like 4 pages. And then we have chapter 12, which is Richard Wright. And I'm excited for that one because I have one of his books. It's from my papa's collection. I have Black Boy and Native Son, and like my papa liked him because of this similar origins that they come from. And his chapter is really short, and then we have the conclusion and then discussion videos. And then for the next book, we're gonna do like reading discussion, different than how we did this book. But anyways, let's get started. Coming to terms with the Marxist tradition. The year following the printing of Jacobins, James published A History of Negro Revolt. This was to be his last sustained statement on Pan-Africanism until the appearance of Nkrumah and the Ghana Revolution. It was, though, a minor piece, summarizing in historical shorthand some of the occasions of Black rebellion in the diaspora and Africa in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. It would prove to be of some use 3 decades later, but it was casually written, more a public lecture than a study. James was now at the center of the Trotskyist international movement, and soon he was to be just as immersed in the American theater, stirring up things in New York, disputing with Trotsky over the Negro question, organizing sharecroppers and tenant farmers in southeast Missouri. Period. 10 years after Jacobins, James wrote a second masterpiece amid a crisis in which he was deeply involved. On this occasion, he found it necessary to frontally assault some of the principal figures of the Marxist movement. And the work is Notes on Dialectic, was written in the late 1940s, a moment when the preoccupations of the Second World War had faded, leaving American Marxists free to ponder the changed circumstances they faced. The significance of post-war arrangements between the Soviet Union and the Western powers, the reactions of their country's working classes to the domination of the world economies by American capital. The orchestrated expulsion of communists from the American labor movement, the convergent pressures on the communist movement from the American government and the Soviet Union, and for Trotskyists, the future of the Fourth International shorn of Trotsky, its unifying symbol. By now, James had become a prominent intellectual and organizer in the Socialist Workers' Party, SWP, the American representation of the Fourth International. In this restricted arena, it was fair to say he was being recognized for what he was, one of the leading Marxist historian philosophers in the country. With Max Shatman, however, he and others had withdrew from the SWP. In the early 1940s, they formed a workers' party with 600 or so members. Then, in 1942, a further split had occurred. A group centering on James and Raya. Dunayevskaya. I'm sorry. Dunayevskaya. The Johnson Forest tendency had left the Shamantes. We're gonna have to look that up. I'm gonna underline it for later. I feel like I've written a note for that, but I'm not entirely sure, so I don't want to be like, this is what it is. I wanna take you away. I'm not gonna lie, I'm very disorganized. Let me show you how many notebooks. Well, you can say this is organized or some. I almost caught it. And then I have 1, 2, 3, 4 over there, and a lot over there. It's somewhere in there. Later in 1949 or so, the Johnson-Forrest tendency would rejoin the SWP, only to become resolutely independent again 2 years later. They required more. And then here's a quote. We had broken with Trotsky's analysis of the nature of the Russian state since the death of Lenin. We came to the conclusion that a fundamental investigation still remained to be done on Hegel's science of logic, and then in parentheses, with that, of course, had to be associated the smaller logic, a section of Hegel's encyclopedia. And that's the end of the quote. Notes on dialectics was James's contribution. It was his logical and philosophical consideration and reconstruction of the history of the labor movement in relation to the formation of revolutionary action, parties, and revolutionary thought in the European experience. The grammar of the work, its logical structure, was grounded on Hegel's construction of the dialectic. It was at once an exposition of Hegel's, I feel like I'm always saying his name wrong, philosophical method and the historical movement of the working classes. And when it was written, its immediate purpose was to provide a rationale and a historical object for the political activity of his small organization, to preserve for his comrades the claim for the Leninism of an authentic socialism. Importante. It was they who were seeking to contain a catastrophe, to rescue Marxism from its self-inflicted wounds, and then in parentheses, Stalinism and Trotskyism, thus preserving its theoretical and political core, in parentheses, historical materialism and the revolutionary proletariat. I wrote down historical, materialism? Somewhere. Let me see. Let me just look it up though. Because sometimes, you know how people have, like, there's a lot of words. And sometimes I get confused when people say historical materialism or dialectical materialism, and then materialism of the, I'm just like, wait. I need to write this down, because if I don't write it down, because the reason why I have so many notebooks is because if I don't write it down, I don't know. I don't understand. Like, I can't do math problems in my head. I have to write it down. I mean, girl. Historical materialism is a theory developed by Karl Marx and Engels, which posits that the primary driver of social and political change is the development of economic forces and the ways humans organize their labor to produce and exchange goods. It suggests that the social institutions, including government and religion, are shaped by the prevailing mode of production, and the contradictions within these modes of production ultimately lead to social transformation. But if that was the case, who had the critique on him? Was it Du Bois? Class struggle. That's we'll come back. We'll come back to that. Anyways, their task was not an easy one. It was just a political battle. It was not just a political battle to be waged. A small organization in opposition to former, in parentheses, Trotskyist colleagues, in opposition to Stalinism, the trade union, bureaucracies, the apparatus of the American state, and world capitalism. These forces were more than balanced, they believed, since they were in the company of the proletarian masses. History and numbers were on their side. More decisive were the contradictions they hoped to rationalize. As Marxists, damn, I need some chapstick. As Marxists, they were compelled to juggle contending impulses. They were a radical intelligentsia, contemptuous of the revolutionary petite bourgeoisie in the same sense themselves. They were revolutionary ideologues charged by their tradition to criticize everything while conserving the figures of Marx and Lenin. They were committed to the abolition of parties, but their entire political history had been in association and contention with revolutionary parties. They were renegade bourgeois ideologists trained in the ruling ideas of their time Yet they believed in the imperative of penetrating the consciousness of the working classes in order to comprehend the proletariat's historical activity. That's their contradiction. Importante. Where am I? Oh, right there. What color should we do? Orange. Oh, no, yellow. We don't have that much yellow back here. O-R-A-N-G-E. I'm really glad that I've been able to read and reread this book because it has allowed me to like understand things more. Like when I first read it, sometimes I'd be like, huh? And rereading it over and over again, I'm like, oh, okay. But we'll come back to that. But it's interesting. It's like they're saying like we're trying to make like we are in this position of like upper class, and we're trying to create a revolutionary like theory and stuff like that, knowing that ideology is coming from the working class. We're in the middle class. That's how I'm getting it right now. We probably will elaborate in the discussion part, but it's like coming from the middle class, trying to make revolutionary ideologies from that working class consciousness, but we don't have that experience type of thing. That's one part of the word. Believed in the imperative of penetrating the consciousness of the working class in order to comprehend the proletariat's historical activity. And then they're saying that even though we are, okay, while holding up Marx and Lenin as well. Okay, but we'll come back. And despite their sometimes feverish energies, they were essentially contemplative didactics coupled with revolutionary action. James could not escape these contradictions any more than Grace Lee Boggs, or the name that we said before, because they're highlighting their own contradictions within the work, which is a good thing. Dunayevaskay. Neither could Notes on Dialectics. It contained an ideate from which James had no intention of departing, but was compelled to leave behind. He supposed Hegel's dialectic would resolve the dilemma. The delinquent premise was restated by James in the 1980 edition of the work. And then this is in quotations. What is then the beginning of the labor movement? ? We find the historical beginning in the French Revolution as Marx saw it. The French Revolution being their kind of, you know how like on social media, we gotta get like the French. But like the French are operating within a Eurocentric ideology. Simply put, very simply put, versus Black radicalism, like enslaved people revolting, which is a different ideological source. Africa. And their cultural, historical beings, you know what I mean? But let me keep going. This was the unchallengeable presumption. Marxists had to begin where Marx had begun, and as Marx had begun. So they're saying, like, within that Marxist tradition, typically people will start with the French Revolution as a source of revolutionary action and ideology, rather than looking at people that are often at the peripheries, or often at the margins, at the wayside, which are third world, indigenous, Black and brown peoples, women, stuff like that. But that's importante. So we're going to make a little mark. Okay. So I'm going to read that part again. No, I'm good. It meant that the assumption made in Marx's vision of modern history had to persist in James's consideration of social revolution. The notion that implied that the proletariat constituted a class like the bourgeoisie. Like most Marxists, James was quite unwilling to contemplate that, as Cornelius Castoriadis, Castoriadis, had made clearer than anyone. Since the appearance of the bourgeoisie was historically the origin of the category class, it would be philosophically had made clear, was quite unwilling to contemplate that as had made clearer than anyone. Since the appearance of the bourgeoisie was historically the origin of the category class, it would be philosophically and historically impossible for the proletariat to recapitulate the social and ideological experience of the bourgeoisie. It could not become a class in those terms. Okay. But there had been to be limits within which the Johnson-Forrest tendency was to remain. They had realized almost too late that as Trotskyists, without knowing it, they had flirted with the disintegration of Marxism. This is a quote, Trotskyist thinking persisted in, led the posing of the question of the disintegration of Marxist theory, questioning whether we might not have to ask ourselves if it were valid. Page 56. Their need to do things differently was to be a disciplined need. And in his consideration of Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, and Marx, James made good use of his procedures. Girl, what? What book are you reading? Predecessors. It's okay. It's funny. We'll move on. Holding strictly to the lights of the tradition. His critique, notwithstanding his fundamental deference, was true to form, internally consistent, devastatingly powerful, erudite. Let's look that one up. Erudite. Having or showing great knowledge or learning. And logically near flawless. Within its own terms, James would take the philosophic discourse of the Marxian tradition to its most complete realization in the post-war years. He began by assuring his comrades that their appearance, their work, and their politics based on the evolution of state capitalism and the proletarian impulse for an organizational form that transcended the Revolutionary Party were anticipated in Hegel's Science of Logic. Theirs were the new ideas Hegel had anticipated. The opposition to them among Stalinists, Trotskyists, and I feel like I'm saying that I feel bad for saying it wrong. Okay. Believe that Stalin, rulers of proclaimed socialist country, new ruling. Okay, that's a lot. Pronunciation, that's all I want. Shaktmanites. Okay, Shaktmanites. Why do I say the sh sounds church? Oh. Shaktmanites. Girl, what? Don't make fun of me. S-H-A. What? The ch sound is similar to the ch in church, and the ite is the pronounced like ite in elite. Oh, elite. Eat. Shaktmanites. We're moving on. Was corrupted by formalism and opportunism. Paraphrasing Hegel's, James asserted, and here's the quote, imperceptibly, the new ideas became familiar even in their opposers, who appropriated them, and, though persistently slighting and gainsaying the sources and principles of those ideas, yet had to accept their results. We can see this in our whole development. The chief, or one of the most striking examples of our application of the law of value to the Russian economy. Today, these goddamned scoundrels all turn up and say, of course, but you could look through the literature of the Fourth International for pages and pages. I do not remember any statement to that effect. Oh, from page 13. He reminded them that Hegel had distinguished between vulgar empiricism, understanding, and reason, dialectical thought. Oh, I wrote that down somewhere, talking about like reasoning between two opposing, contradictory viewpoints. I don't think it's this one. It's not this one. It's not this one either. Oh. Anyways, charging each with a certain value, a certain threshold of thought. The dialectic was the ultimate realization of the mind of the subject. Clearly, he suggested, Lenin had been capable of dialectical thought, capable of transcending through his thought the old categories, in parentheses, Second International, that he had inherited. And then this is a quote. The Russian Revolution of February caused violent changes in Lenin's categories. World War I set him revising the categories of the Second International. That's from page 17. On the other hand, however, Trotsky had been limited to understanding, a necessary and useful stage of thought, but one that could end in its reduction to absolute categories. And then here's a quotation. He would have been able to lecture you on changing categories most profoundly. He talks about them all the time. But fixed and finite determinations held him by the throat to the end. Page 18. And that's really interesting because like that's one of the what do you call it? Critiques of Eurocentric thought in general is the way in which it's like black or white, good or bad, and how anti-blackness is considered bad, evil, demonic. Whiteness is good, holy, godly, pure, stuff like that. It's that's that set in stone, this versus that thinking, or that and that very concrete categories that keep us confined, or like gender roles, man or woman, that's it, nothing else. And it's like, girl, well, biologically, how about the intersex? How about, hello? And then trying to be transphobic, what's wrong? Why, if someone can do it, why not? How is that going to affect you? Girl, please, get out of here. If you can be racist, if you can be sexist, they can be whatever they want. Shit. That's a bad joke, but whatever. Anyways. No, but it's just ridiculous in that sense. People the non-binary. Girl, what does it matter to you? But still, it's that those strict defined categories. As an example, man or woman, and that's it. You can't be non-binary. You can't be transgender. You can't be intersex. You can't do this, that, and the third. And it's kind of if that can't happen, then why are they here? Your logic is illogical, in my opinion, but that's a conversation for another day. Anyways, Trotsky had been unwilling to recognize the true significance of Stalinism. Stalinism is a necessary and inevitable form of and here's a quote. Stalinism is a necessary and inevitable form of development of the labor movement. The workers were not mistaken. They were not deceived. Not in any serious sense of the words, they were making an experience that is necessary to their own development. Page 30. Trotsky had been convinced that a labor bureaucracy, in parentheses, as had occurred with the old category, ... what's the name of that? It was on the tip of my tongue. Whatever. The Second International would protect private property. So Trotsky had been convinced that the labor bureaucracy would protect private property. Trotsky had been committed to the end to winning the debate with Stalin over the permanent revolution versus socialism in one country. while the Stalinists were practical and went about seizing and then preserving their power and, incidentally, state property, Trotsky continued to defend himself in the most fixed terms, contending with his ghosts over who was closer to Lenin. And then here's a quote. Thus, the debate, beginning with socialism in a single country, remained forever and ever within the categories of Leninism. Stalin said, "Whatever I do is Leninism." Trotsky said, "No, it is not Leninism. I am the genuine Leninist." This was the setting. Stalin was not very serious about it. His actions were pure empiricism. Trotsky was serious about this Leninism and was caught in it and strangled in it. He was entirely wrong in every theoretical and practical conclusion that was drawn from the debate. The debate was that socialism could not be built in a single country. Does anyone believe that Stalin or any of his people believe... Bless you! Does anyone believe that Stalin or any of his people believe that what is in Russia is socialism? ? Only an utter fool can think so. What the debate was about was whether the state property system would be maintained without a revolution sooner or later in the West. Page 350. Okay. And of course, while Trotsky had fixed at the level of understanding, he never possessed the energy nor the insight to realize that Stalinism could be understood by revealing its economic basis. And then here's a quote. He did not see that the revolutionary Third International had succumbed to state capitalism aided by Russian imperialism. He never wrote about the economic changes, what he thought about it, and if he did, he never thought of sufficient importance to set down. Astonishing, isn't it? Page 37. Those who wish to continue with the struggles of the proletariat to comprehend the emergence of Stalinism could no longer afford to indulge Trotsky. Another quote. New categories, the impulses, the instinctive actions, the strong knots formed were observed, talked about, but always incorporated into the old shell. State capitalism, importante. State capitalism or reformist international that would destroy private property and refuse to support the bourgeoisie in imperialist war and anti-proletarian bureaucracy that throve on state property and would defend it to the last against private property. All the knots, impulses, etc., which drove these into the mind were allowed in only in so far as they filled into the form and finished categories that Lenin left. Like, they weren't allowed to expand. They weren't allowed, like, the new ideas had to fit into the old, the same structure. Like if you think about like feminism, when we think about like white feminism, it's like feminism that's still, it's like equality in the same, it's an equality in a racist structure. You really want equality in a racist structure, or do you want no racism, you know? And so it's like that's how it's kind of clicking in my mind. If that doesn't make sense, let me know, and I can see if I can make a different association versus like intersectional feminism, black feminism, womanism. That's going beyond those set categories informed by the patriarchy. Does that make sense? I hope it does. If it doesn't, let me know. That is why what were the results of reason in one generation became understanding in another, and the negating, the transcending of the determinations into a higher unity cannot be done. Page 34. Trotsky had thus mistaken Stalinism for a workers' bureaucracy. He had been incapable of transcending the once powerful categories derived from the experience of the Second International, page 59, in order to recognize the further maturation of the contradictions of a workers' movement in capitalist society. Hegel, of course, had anticipated Trotsky's error. Consciousness discovering what was truth only for a particular version, criterion, standards. Consciousness discovering what was truth only for the particular vision, criterion, standards with which it looked on the world, page 54. Appearance had superseded actuality. This is another quote. But you and I are dialecticians. We know that Stalinism today is the true state of the labor movement. It is revolutionary, repudiating parliamentarianism. Why was that hard? Parliamentarianism. Parliamentarianism. Why does that sound? I'm not saying it right. Parliamentarianism. Okay. Private property, national defense, and national boundaries. It is, however, attached to an imperialism as patron and is bureaucratic and aims at totalitarian control of labor. What's wrong with my tongue? It's not moving right. I don't know. It is, however, attached to an imperialism as patron and is bureaucratic and aims at totalitarian control of labor and then capital, page 43. To know true reality, to understand the labor movement, is to know that at each stage it degenerates but splits to reinstate its self-identity, its unity, but that this unity comes from divisions within its own self. Stalinism is a better obstacle, but see it as a part of a process. Though the process of its own development, the seriousness, the suffering, the patience, and the labor of the negative, the labor movement goes through all of its experiences and reaches its completely realized self only by conquering them one after the other. And only at the end, when the labor movement finds itself fully realized, will we see what it is in very truth. Lenin had realized that workers in Hegel's discussion of the doctrines of being and essence. Lenin had realized the workers in Hegel's discussion of the doctrines of being and essence. It could be seen that his note on the logic contained his revolutionary program in Information, pages 98 through 106. He had discerned the self-government of the proletariat, the movement that was the working class's being. He comprehended that, and here's a quotation, the essence of a thing is the fact that it must move, reflect itself, negate the reflection, which was nothing, become being, and then become nothing again, while the thing itself must move on because it is its nature to do so. The essence of the proletariat, is its movement to incorporate in itself experience of the evils of capitalism until it overcomes capitalism itself. Importante. Oh, why does that look like that? Get off me. Right. Page 78. James insisted that Lenin would not have understood that the history of the Third International is the history of the suppression of Leninism by Stalinism, and that finally, if the Fourth International is to supersede Stalinism, then it must contain Stalinism in its concept of itself. It begins from all the things that Stalinism took over from Leninism and kept. The other of Stalinism is an international socialist economic order, embracing from the start whole continents, page 87, because this incredible man, page 138, had understood that Soviets, when they came in 1917, in parentheses, but admittedly not in 1905, in the parentheses, Lenin would know that the movement dominated by the capitalist perversion of the revolutionary party he created. Another quote. There is nothing more to organize. You can organize workers as workers. You can create a special organization of revolutionary workers. But once you have those two, you have reached an end. Organization, as we have known it, is at an end. The task is to abolish organization. The task today is to call for, to teach, to illustrate, to develop spontaneity, the free creative activity of the proletariat. We'll come back to that, but think about that. The proletariat will find, and proletariat is like the most working class. And typically, and Du Bois is able to show how the proletariat and black workers, black peasants, enslaved people, and think about the music and the culture that was created out of enslaved societies, and that's across the African diaspora. Like, and it's Shh. We'll come back. I'm excited for that. The proletariat will find its method of proletarian organization and contradiction par excellence. At this stage, the vanguard can only organize itself on the basis of the destruction of the stranglehold that the existing organizations have on the proletariat, by means of which it is suffering such ghastly defeats. Page 117. Stalinism, the counter-revolution that has emerged from arrested Leninism, page 105, would inevitably and spontaneously be opposed by the workers' movement, because the great masses or classes only learned through struggle against some concrete thing. Page 93. The proletariat itself will smash Stalinism to pieces. This experience will teach it its final lesson. The future lies in itself and not in anything which claims to represent it or direct it. Page 92. James finished the work, harvesting all the materials. He culled them in order to present one of the most exciting historical constructions to be produced by a Marxist thinker. Patiently, deliberately, systematically, but always mediated by his lyrical and sometimes mischievous literary voice. I'm sorry. Oh, we're almost done. Mischievous voice. He distilled from 300 years of European history the processes and lineages of the contending forces within the proletarian movement, the revolutionary petite bourgeoisie and the working masses. The former, the revolutionary petite bourgeoisie, he maintained, made its first appearance in the English Civil War of the 17th century as radical Democrats. The latter were the social basis for the revolutionary masses behind the French Revolution. However, each had undergone transformations through the long years between their appearances and the present, that is, 1948. These changes were the results not of years, but of capitalism. These two opposing historical forces had at last reached their final articulation in Stalinism and fascism. In Stalinism, the petite bourgeoisie had organized the attempted destruction of the revolutionary proletariat. The petite bourgeoisie began by using the workers to destroy the bourgeoisie, and then the suppression of the workers' movement had followed. In fascism, the petite bourgeoisie had become the social instrument of the increasingly desperate bourgeoisie, in effect to destroy the same historical subject, the workers' movement. Okay. Together, fascism and Stalinism constituted the objective movement, in parentheses, centralization of capitalist organization. Page 201. The continuing development of the organization of capitalist production and the bureaucratic administration of state capitalism had called forth a petite bourgeois class of enormous skill, responsibility, and ambitions. Within those same centuries, then, though it was possible to trace the maturation of the bourgeoisie and the working classes, it was also necessary to recognize the transformation of the petite bourgeoisie. It was necessary because this strata had presumed the leadership of the proletarian movement and then betrayed it. Okay. Now the radical intelligentsia at the service of the proletarian revolution activists like those in the Johnson Forest tendency had to respond to these events. First, it was to comprehend them, ceasing to identify the perversion of petite bourgeois leadership with the authentic forces of the revolution. Second, the vanguard of vanguards had to assist the proletariat in the destruction of the revolutionary proletarian bureaucracy. The direction of the world was in the hands of the workers. The proletariat will decide. The thing is to tell the proletariat to decide. Page 118, page 181. To the misfortune of Notes on Dialectic, it was an internal document. It was like non-circulating. Thus, for 2 decades, its distribution was restricted. The more so since the movement to which it was addressed was small. It would not be widely read for 30 years, but though James could recognize it as his most extraordinary work, it did contain certain limitations. The most obvious problem stemmed from James's fascination for Hegel's mode of argumentation, the distillation of history into rich concentrations used solely for the grounding of abstract discourse. It was also the case that this history was exclusively European. An inadvertent but natural substantiation of Hegel's own assertion of where history could occur. James's style was also familiar in another way. The language was the combative one of the Marxist exigencies. Exigencies. Exigencies?
Exegesis.
Exegesis. Critical explanation or interpretation of a text. Exegesis. Inherited from German philosopher, a dismissive tongue used to humiliate opposition. Think about that in terms of like, okay, I'm not gonna lie. Typically, like, you'll see within like the political discourse on the left, it's like the way that people talk to each other, it's like talking down on and being like, you're dumb. And don't get me wrong, sometimes I do it, but I do it in the terms of like, oh, you're racist, you're dumb. Because I do believe if you're racist, you're stupid. But listen, hold up. Let me give a little bit more context. No, I cannot. I think it's because racism is a stupid ideology. Anti-blackness, stupid. Misogyny, stupid. Homophobia, stupid. Ableism, stupid. All the isms, obias, and phobias that are rooted in oppression and violence and death, stupid. Very real, but stupid. Because, like, that doesn't even make logical sense. Like, really? You're superior over someone, so that means that you get to dominate and conquer and kill? There's something wrong with that. That's weird. That's what I mean. So I will be like, that's stupid. But at the same time, people are socialized. Like, you're not birthed with a Confederate flag. You know, you're taught to hate something. You're taught to hate someone. You're taught to hate a culture. You're taught to hate a people. You don't come out hating. You know, you're a baby. So it's taught. So that there's nuance, there's this, or there's context, excuse me. Yeah. Its results were predictable corollaries. The absolute deprecation of the fallen. Stalin, Trotsky, that other one, SHACHTAMAN, and etc. In contrast to oratory for true thinkers, Hegel, Marx, Lenin, Engels, Lenin. James relished the form and employed it consistently until he was able to rescue the tenor of his argument in the historical flourish with which he ended. Still, Notes on Dialectics was a remarkable achievement. It was a too rare example of a living, active, grappling. It was a too rare example of a living, active, grappling Marxism. Its conceits were small ones given the company it kept, though its author had no hesitation to assume the role of headmaster to Western Marxists. His grounds were substantial. The questions then being raised in the Marxist movement were so misconceived as inevitably to suggest abolition of the tradition itself. He had, in many ways, always succeeded in anchoring Marxist thought in the 20th century when to many it seemed that Lenin had accomplished the very opposite. Its annihilation as a reference. He had shown a new direction when it seemed all such possibilities were at its end. Our treatment of James must end here. However, his writing and politics continued. Deported from the United States in 1952, he returned to Britain. Spent a few years at home in Trinidad, only to return to the United States, then Britain. Following Notes on Dialectic, he wrote State Capitalism and World Revolution in 1950. At Ellis Island, while awaiting action by the U.S. Department of Immigration and Naturalization, he composed Mariners, Renegades, and Castaways, a political literary critique of Herman Melville's Moby Dick and Pierre, that included observations on detention and his personal conflict-ridden encounter with American communist prisoners. Within the next 10 years, he would publish Facing Reality with Grace Lee and Pierre Chalot. In 1958, Modern Politics, his 1960 lectures in Trinidad, in parentheses, C.L.R, Beyond a Boundary, a significant appendix to the reissue, of The Black Jacobins, which was published in 1963, and a stream of reviews, introductions, articles, and position papers the range of which is suggested in the recently published collections The Future in the Present and Spheres of Existence. Of his major works, it was the first that would draw James into the orbit of radical thought in the 1960s and afterward. It was the Black diaspora, particularly the militant Black petite bourgeoisie that had grown impatient with American apartheid, which would rediscover Jacobins. First the book and then the author would help them to confirm their ideological struggle with bourgeois culture. The mass Black movement provided the compulsion. James astounded the new Black intelligentsia with his brilliant thought, his provocative analyses, and his grasp of Black history. He became once again Nello to inmates 2 generations younger than his contemporaries. He became the teacher they could honor, a living, absorbing link between themselves and a past of which most had only a vague notion, or, just as frequently, a profound expectation. But he also sometimes saddened them, pitching divisive battles in fields peopled only with Marxian phantoms. That when they had recovered him, he had again become accustomed to presenting himself as a Black European. Ooh. Some came to understand something of what he expected of them, but he also learned a great deal of my time has been spent in seeing how much I failed to understand when I was young and my whole life was towards European literature. European literature, European sociology. Now I'm beginning to see, and it is helping me to write. Perhaps his long-awaited autobiography will ultimately demonstrate just how permanently their reflective gift of the Black radical tradition had affected him. What he gave them is no mystery. Period. Okay, we're done. That was a lot. Now I misspoke. Now we're going on to chapter 11. That was chapter 10. Anyways, thank you for listening. I really appreciate it, and I'll see you again for the next one. Have a good day.